Hey, what up? This your boy Janky. Today I'm making a video on how to wood stain and finish some butcher block. Now, I'm not a carpenter or a woodworker by trade, but I did watch some videos on YouTube so I can learn how to do some of this stuff. So today will be my first attempt on something like this. I hope that you guys learn something from it, and I hope it turns out well. Anyway, let's get right to it. So obviously the first thing you're gonna need is a piece of wood for whatever project you're working on. Now in my case, I bought some butcher block from Lowe's. You can also find these butcher blocks at Home Depot. I believe that IKEA also sells some. This particular one, like I said, I bought at Lowe's for about $200. It's approximately 6 feet long by about 30 inches wide. So it's untreated. I can stain it to whatever color I want, and it's pretty solid and heavy. My intention for this is to make a custom office desk for my house, and this should serve nicely and should last many, many years. Okay guys, here's some of the basic stuff that you're gonna need for a project like this. Now I bought most of this stuff at Home Depot. They are readily available and they're pretty inexpensive. So the first thing I would recommend is a wood conditioner. You're gonna apply this to the wood prior to you staining it. And that just makes sure that the wood stain goes on evenly without any blotches. Then you're gonna need your wood stain. Obviously, you get to pick whatever color you want. This particular wood stain is an oil-based wood stain. After the staining process, you're gonna wanna finish it and seal it using polyurethane. Now this is a water-based polyurethane. You can actually use a water-based polyurethane with an oil-based wood stain as long as you give ample time for the stain to dry. So usually that takes 24 hours or so. Then you're gonna need some sandpaper, or in this case, I bought some sanding sponges. I just think it's easier to work with. Now the butcher block already came pretty smooth, but I'm gonna smooth it out even more using 220 grit. And then you're gonna need some sort of a old t-shirt or a rag just to pick up any of the loose wood dust that you'll be creating during the sanding process. In this case, I just bought some tack cloths from Home Depot as well. These work really well in picking up any wood dust. Then I bought some staining pads. I'm going to be using this to apply the wood conditioner and also the wood stain itself. And then you're going to need some sort of a brush, either a hairbrush, a synthetic hairbrush, or a foam brush. In this case, I picked a foam brush only because it was cheap. It's disposable. After I'm done with it, I just toss it. That's about 99 cents. Then you want to have like an old shop rag or something, or an old t-shirt. And then maybe some gloves to protect your hands so that you don't get stained. Anyway, that's about it. We're gonna get started in a bit and I'll show you guys what's next. So the first thing we're gonna do is we're gonna prep our wood surface. And when I say prep, we're actually gonna do some light sanding on the wood surface itself, just so we have a nice, even, smooth surface to work with. Now I'm gonna be using a 220 grit sanding sponge. You can also use some sandpaper. This block of wood right here actually came already pretty smooth, but I'm gonna smooth it out even more using the sanding sponge. Make sure that you hit up both sides of the board, and also don't forget the sides. And always go along the grain of the wood whenever you're doing any type of sanding or painting. So let's get to it. So after you do your initial sanding, you're gonna wanna pick up all the loose wood dust that you created. You can either use an old t-shirt or a damp rag, something like that, just to get all the dust off. In this case, I'm gonna use a tack cloth because these work really well as far as getting all the dust off. So after you finish sanding and getting all the dust off, the next step is to apply the wood conditioner. What you're gonna do is you're gonna mix this up really well. And then after that, you are going to apply a liberal amount on all the surfaces of the wood, including the edges. And you're gonna let that penetrate for about 2 to 5 minutes. Now to apply it, you can either use a paintbrush, or in this case, I'm just gonna use a staining sponge and use that to spread that all over. So don't forget both sides. You're gonna let that sit for about 2 to 5 minutes, and then you're gonna use an old t-shirt or a rag to wipe off the excess. After an additional 20 to 30 minutes, it'll be completely dry. Then you'll be ready to actually apply your wood stain. So let's get to it. Okay, so after the wood conditioner has dried, you can go ahead and move on to the next step, which is the actual staining of the wood surface. If for some reason you feel any of the grain raised up after the wood conditioner process, you can just go ahead and lightly sand that again with the 220 grit sandpaper and just wipe off the dust. But if you're all good, then you can go ahead and start staining. So what you want to do is mix this up really well. And then after that, you can use either a paintbrush, or in this case, I'm going to use a staining pad once again. And you're going to apply a liberal coat of the stain onto the wood surface, both sides, and don't forget the edges. Any excess stain that remains on the wood, you want to wipe that along the grain of the wood, and then you're going to just let that dry. Now, after 2 hours, you can apply your second coat, but we're going to go ahead and apply the first coat to this butcher block, and let's see how it turns out. So I just finished applying the first coat of the wood stain, and this is what the wood looks like now. I think it looks pretty good. So the next step is just waiting. We're gonna wait about 2 hours for this to dry a little bit. And then after that, it'll be ready for a second coat of wood stain. And that should develop the color even more. So it'll probably get even darker than this. So see you guys in a couple of hours. So I just finished the second coat of wood stain. I pretty much just followed the same steps as I did with the first one. And this is what the butcher block looks like now. As you guys can see, the color has developed even more, and it's like a shade darker than what it was. Now, normally, if you're happy with whatever color you get after 2 coats of wood stain, then you can stop here, let this dry for 24 hours, and move on to the next step, which is the polyurethane. But what I'm gonna do, for good measure, I'm gonna apply a third coat. So I'm gonna wait an additional 2 hours and then reapply it. And then I'll be back to apply the polyurethane. Okay, once your stain has dried, then you're ready to move on to the next step, which is to apply the polyurethane. So what you wanna do is mix up your polyurethane really well. In this case, I'm gonna use a stick. You don't wanna shake it because you don't wanna create bubbles in the polyurethane. And then you're gonna take your brush, either a foam brush or a hairbrush. Then you're just going to dip it in the polyurethane, and you're just gonna do a nice light coat over the surface of the wood, always going with the grain of the wood, just like this. Now, it's always helpful to have some sort of a light source when you're doing this, so that you can kind of see which spots you've already hit up, or if you need to follow up on certain spots or whatever. So that's really good. Now, some people, they only do the top side of a table. I like to do both sides because I really want the table to be finished, completely finished. So that's what I'm gonna do. Then once you've applied the polyurethane on all the surfaces, don't forget you're gonna do the sides as well, the edges. You're gonna wait 2 hours for it to dry. Then you can apply a second coat. Just a couple more things worth mentioning before I get started is that you may notice that the polyurethane has this white milk-like consistency and color to it, but don't worry about that. Once you spread on the poly onto your surface and once it dries, it'll dry into a crystal clear finish. And also remember to always work in a well-ventilated area so that you're not inhaling fumes. I also like to have a Ziploc baggie on hand so I can store my brush in it while I'm waiting for it to dry, just so my brush doesn't dry out. So with that being said, let's get started. So after 2 hours or so, the first coat of poly that you put on should be dry. And now you're ready for the next step. Now the next step is you're going to lightly sand the surface of the wood using a fine grit sandpaper, about 220 grit. And you're going to sand it along the grain of the wood, just like this. And as you're sanding, you're going to notice that there's going to be like a fine white powder that develops. And that's from the poly. Lightly sand the entire surface of the wood, both sides. Don't forget the edges. Once you sand everything, don't forget to wipe out all the dust that accumulates using either an old rag, an old t-shirt, or a tack cloth if you have it. And after you clean it up and clean out all the dust, then you're ready to apply a second coat of poly, just like you did the first one. So after you've sanded down and cleaned up the dust from your first coat, now you're ready to apply the second coat of poly. After the second coat of poly has dried, you will be ready to move on to the next step, which is to apply the third and final coat of poly. As you can see, it has developed a nice sheen to it. It's looking real nice. The only thing you have to do now is to follow the same steps as you did with the second coat, which is to lightly sand all the surfaces of the wood using the 220 grit sandpaper. Then you're going to wipe off all the dust. Then you're going to apply the third and final coat of poly and let that dry for at least a few hours, I would say overnight. So after 3 coats of wood stain and 3 coats of poly, this is the final result. And I'm very, very happy with the way it turned out. As you guys can see, the colors have developed quite nicely. Beautiful pattern on the wood. You can see all the wood grain there. It's just an awesome looking tabletop. Check that out. That's gonna be beautiful. There's also a nice subtle sheen to it. The poly that I used was that satin finish. So you guys can see it's not too glossy. It's not exactly a matte finish. Somewhere in between. Now it's all preference what you like, so you do you. Anyway, this tabletop is going to be the centerpiece for my next project, which is an office desk for my house. So that'll probably be my next YouTube video, so go ahead and check that out. But anyway, I'm very, very happy with the way this turned out. I think that's just awesome. Beautiful. So that's about it for today's video. I hope that you guys learned something today, and I hope that it proves useful in case you're thinking of doing a similar project for yourself in the future. Now, like I said, this is the first time I've tried something like this, and it was a fun experience learning the whole staining process and finishing it and all that. Now, it was not very hard. Just take your time and don't be afraid to make mistakes. If you have any questions, leave it in the comment section, and I'll try my best to answer whatever questions you may have. And don't forget to leave a like for this video. It really helps out my channel. And if you have not already, go ahead and subscribe and hit that bell icon so that you'll get notified whenever I come up with new content. Anyway, that's about it. Thanks for stopping by, and I'll see you on the next one. Peace.